customer success of documentation, or using bots and Mad Libs for editing docs. Sounds kind of cool. Those discussions are happening downstairs right now, so if you want to go, make your brain work a little bit, get up and moving, feel free to kind of go down there and chat with people. So now to start, this is Matthew Lyon with minimum viable documentation.
Hi, you can call me Matt Lee if you ever meet me. I'm a developer, and I have built and launched a few products now. I've led the development of the most recent one of those. And I want to talk to you today about what I think the role of documentation in product development is. I hope to arm you with a few tools for getting involved earlier in the development process. And in particular, there is a movement going on called minimum viable product. And there we go. This is an interesting idea. The term is thrown around a lot, and sometimes it means what is the simplest thing that we can do to gauge the demand for what we're going to build. Sometimes it's just a sign-up form. But ultimately what it comes down to is that I believe building software is expensive, and there's a lot of risks to it. Those of you who are here in Oregon are probably familiar with the Cover Oregon website, which I believe the state has spent a lot of money on, and they're having to declare it a failure and go back to using the Affordable Care website for the national healthcare.gov. And building software is hard. You want to try and shepherd it along nicely, and this is a process for doing so with taking on a least amount of risk. So you want to test the feasibility of your idea and determine, is it worth sinking more money into? Is it worth sinking more resources into? And even if you don't, even if you're not actually spending money on it, even if it's just your time, you still have the opportunity cost. You want to determine if you're building the right thing, and you want to really just get your crappy draft out there early. You also want to build as little as possible, and unfortunately a lot of things get cut to the bone on that, and documentation is one of the first things to go, because I believe a lot of project managers don't understand how it's valuable. And in particular, in what we call the lean development process, where you're cutting a lot of these things down, documentation is not something that a lot of people find to be that important, and I want to help you change that. This process is pretty hard. There's a very narrow point in between what is too minimal and what is too much. And if you build too little, maybe it wasn't really enough to prove that the idea was feasible. One of the core components of this philosophy is that you can rely on early adopters to kind of pick up the slack for you. But I don't think that early adopters are necessarily the best use case, the best target user for a lot of types of products. I mean, how many people know nerds who use Pinterest, for example? I'm probably one of the only nerds I know who uses Pinterest, and yet it's something that a lot of my non-technical friends use for a lot of things. And early adopters also just have misguided reactions to a lot of things. This is when the iPod was first announced, this was Slashdot's reaction to it. The early adopters have biases that might not fit in with what your vision is, and sometimes you need to have faith in that vision. So I'd like to back up a second and just ask, what is the purpose of building software? Other than cynically, you want to get rich making it. And I believe that software is something to help people solve problems. Maybe that problem is they're bored and they want to play, they want to be entertained. Maybe the problem is they want to do something faster, or they want to do something that saves them money. But I believe that all software is around for the purpose of helping people solve problems, and it has to work better than whatever it is they're doing currently. I don't care how good your to-do list app, it won't beat my index cards and my pen. I use whiteboards a lot, I use sticky notes a lot, and this is something that software just can't touch because the alternative is so much better. My wife is great with spreadsheets and can dance circles around me with them, and I'm still in awe. And I wrangle databases for a living. And back to Cover Oregon, I mean, it kind of comes down to sometimes actually printing something out and faxing it in is better than what you can spend $200 million building. So there's a whole field of study on how we help people solve problems, and it's called user experience, and I believe documentation fits into that. Unfortunately, a lot of people tend to think of documentation as a safety net for your user experience, and I don't think that's necessarily a healthy relationship. One of the things that we do in the development process is come up with personas, and it helps us understand who our users are and what they want to do, and hopefully what they're trying to accomplish by that. It's about empowering people. And unfortunately, by the time they have to go hunting for documentation, sometimes you're not making them awesome anymore. This is one of the reasons why, for example, with games where you're solving the boredom problem, the onboarding, the documentation itself has become, how you teach them to play the game is integrated into the gameplay itself. And a lot of that is, I believe, comes down to empathy. You have to get into the head of whoever it is you're targeting your software for. And unfortunately, this isn't really a core skill for a lot of people who write code for a living or who manage projects. They're focused on the bottom line, they're focused on making their logic work. And I think that, I do a lot of family tech support. I help my parents out with whatever they might need help with on their computer. I try and think of myself before I have coffee in the morning. And it's like, okay, I'm not at my best at that point. And I don't necessarily want to slog through a lot of perhaps really convoluted user interfaces. And I mean, the whole of user interfaces are built on this like really loose grammar of iconography and conventions. And if you're building a very like small, from the base product, you're not going to have this many features, but interfaces are still about manipulating abstractions. And if you don't speak that language, if you don't have a very strong grasp on those conventions and that iconography, you're going to have a very difficult time understanding that interface. If you think about just the evolution of iconography, it used to be that the save icon was a floppy disk. Or you look at the variation of icons that are used in apps today to create something new or search for something. And these are all conventions. And unless you're really immersed in that culture, it can be difficult to grasp that. And if you are immersed in that culture, you don't necessarily understand how difficult it is for people who aren't immersed in that to understand that, okay, an icon of a magnifying glass means find instead of like zoom in. This is a problem, though, that I believe writers are very well equipped to deal with, particularly tech writers. I believe a core skill of writing is to figure out how other people are going to interpret what you're saying. I married into a family of lawyers and have had conversations about the purpose of the core skill of legal writing, which is the same thing. You want to write something such that it carries the intent across with very little room for misinterpretation. And I want to take an aside here and before continuing on and show you some ways that developers are using empathy to help themselves, because I think that it's worth looking at. Developers are very attuned to things that make their lives more difficult, and really, at least I believe that they don't like getting bug reports they don't understand because they have to go recreate something, or they don't like being woken up at 3 a.m. because something broke. The whole notion of test suites and regression tests has gained a lot of popularity because it allows developers to say, okay, with confidence, I can say I haven't broken anything with my new changes. Tests, though, they explain the what. They don't explain the how, they don't explain the why. Developers also use source control. I have a whole thing I could talk about Git archaeology, of digging through past commits to determine why something was created that way, to reconstruct what happened. However, commits also show the what. And so if you're on a team of developers, as a developer, as a manager of those, or even a documentarian working with those, what you want to capture is for the particularly tricky things, what's the context for why something is thorny? If you have a good test and source control hygiene around your product, document the why on smelly code. The knowledge is forgotten as other things are shoveled on top of the code, or as other new shiny things come along. And most people have terrible memories. Spending just 5-10 minutes now writing down why something is convoluted or complex saves a lot of time later. And if you're going through trying to figure out why is this 100-line method so weird, having a little bit of that context goes a long way. The other thing I believe that can help developers is to pair with new people as they come on board. Amelia said earlier something about this, and it's so true. Onboarding a new developer can take about a month, and documentation really helps reduce that a lot. And if you're going from a team of 3 people to a team of 6 people, you don't want to waste 3 months just doubling your team size. Also, it's really hard to tell what's obvious and what's not, and this comes back to empathy. Anyway, getting back to product development, who are your users and what do they want to do? For a new product, you don't have experts. You have people who are approaching something, maybe they want to kick the tires, maybe they want to check it out, but you yourself working on the product aren't going to be able to necessarily identify with that position. Some people, the early adopter types, will be quick to pick up an idea, but will whoever it is that your target audience is be able to do that? And so we have, in the development world, we have man pages, and I think man pages are an example of bad documentation for teaching people how to do something. They're great reference documentation, but they're obtuse and they're difficult, and really I think reference documents are an outboard memory. They're for people who are already familiar with something, who need to refresh their knowledge of how something works, or maybe need to polish up a little bit of that. And don't get me wrong, if you're building an API, you absolutely need reference documents. It's not an option. Don't use this as an excuse to say we don't need reference docs for our API, because you do. But the format is just, it's bad for teaching people about things. It's bad for teaching non-experts how to use your software. So you kind of need to learn how to forget what it is like to be an expert user of your own product. It's really hard to understand what a new user experience is like. And when evaluating anything, user experience, code, your documentation, et cetera, you have to come at it from a perspective of nothing. And in the geek world, at least, we have some tools for doing this, and they're called role-playing games. If you have personas, actually maybe consider going through role-playing sessions from the perspective of people who are going to interpret things differently. If I'm writing something that is aimed at people similar to my parents in terms of technical capabilities, I actually have a pretty good mental understanding now of how my father approaches user interfaces, and I try and come at it from that perspective. So there is, I think, a really good format for helping people learn how to do something, and it's been around for a long time, and it's not necessarily, I think, attractive in its thing, but it's the how-to document, and I believe that for the time put in, they are the biggest bang for the buck in terms of getting somebody to go from 0 to hero. I have time and again seen the power of these things to help normal people do things that they're not experts at. And that includes things outside of software. When my wife and I moved into a new apartment, we decided not to buy any more IKEA furniture, and so we go to websites that teach us how to build furniture, and it's a how-to on building a shelf. I'm a terrible cook, and cookbooks are giant how-to tomes of how do I make a pizza, how do I make burgers without, not cooking them enough to kill myself. The format is popular for developers. I believe that in particular it's kind of migrating to blogs. But I want to take a little bit more time to sell them to you, because I believe that how-tos work with user experience design. They will, if you write them thoroughly, they objectively document the experience. If you look at it from the perspective of somebody who maybe has a lot less savvy than you do, if you have to say, okay, you're looking for a button that's underneath the toolbar, and you're using words, not necessarily screenshots, it helps you understand maybe your interface is a little bit too convoluted or confusing. Maybe the process for doing something is a little bit too confusing. And I think that, honestly, one of the best ways to use them is to link to them from your marketing materials. If you're selling your product as saying you can do something, show me how easy it is. You know, I have an experience lately after Heartbleed of moving a lot of my friends and family onto password password storage services. And in one of these in particular, we were trying to set up some sort of syncing type thing. And it took 15 minutes of digging through their help system before I could come up with an actual how-to on how do I share a password with somebody. And this is like one of their core popular things that is like the main value proposition for me. And here I have to go digging to understand how to do it. And it was not obvious. It should have been linked to from their sales material, but instead I have to go digging. Link to how-tos from your new user experience. If you have any kind of key performance indicator, you know, we want people to create whatever thing, we want how you're measuring success, write how-tos on those and track them, as one of the lightning talk speakers said earlier. If you have uncommon actions for things that are just buried in a junk drawer screen that maybe need to be done every now and then, but you get a lot of support questions on, how-tos are a great way to help people with that. There's also this concept of user experience regressions, where if you're moving quickly and you're trying to keep the state of this program in your head as developers, as user experience people or whatever, you're going to break something eventually. And when that happens, you get customer support things, you get people complaining, and it's horrible. And having how-tos help with that. I believe they can help catch these sorts of things, communicate changes to customers. And if you were to use something like, say, Mechanical Turk, which is an Amazon service for taking people and actually having them do things, you can catch these things before they become huge issues. There's also a concept of user experience debt, and if you keep your how-tos up to date with these decisions that are made for, you know, okay, we don't necessarily know how to do a good user experience for this particular process yet, but the how-to is becoming really long, maybe that will help you realize, okay, it's time to actually spend some time on this now instead of keep continuing to punt on it. I believe that there's also a way for for writers to be proactive in the product development process as well. And there's room for writers to be leaders in that. And again, visiting what developers do, some developers started writing their tests first, and then they wrote the code to pass those tests. And this is a bit controversial right now, but the theory is that by thinking about what success looks like, what failure looks like first, you can write better code. And I believe that if you were to actually thoroughly document what and write about what a user experience would look like before you start building it, you can save a lot of time, you can save a lot of weird clarity issues, and you can hand wave away things that are supposed to be obvious. And actually, if you challenge some assumptions and do that, if you learn a little bit about UX design, you have room to be leaders in this area, because ultimately nobody really knows how to do user experience properly. It's still a very new field, it's still a very new thing, and I do believe that there's room for tech writers to take some leadership here. And that's all I have. There are questions?
So you're talking about the prototyping, and we've just started doing that at my company, and we wanted to keep it really simple, really fast, so we do paper prototyping, because before that... Can you talk about your style of prototyping?
I've done a lot of prototyping. I believe that paper is good. On the other hand, there's some... I do also believe that communicating about it in words, describing it in words, has a lot of value as well. Because it perhaps forces you to get a little bit further away from that shared iconography, the sort of like loose collection of interface abstractions that we have. And paper prototyping is great. What I believe its weakness is that it still forces you to rely on a lot of those conventions, and maybe you're not thinking about what you're trying to help people do so much as how you present it to them.
I think we have time for one more question.
No.
Oh, I just wanted to comment that one of our designers was talking about what she called documentation-driven design, which I think is what you're talking about. And I agree that if there's a conceptual problem, that when you try to explain it, then the conceptual problem comes out, not just the workflow problem.
I mean, I don't have any practical experience with this yet. It's an idea I want to put forth, and I think that it is really possibly a very good thing.
It seems like it. We had an argument about what to name a feature recently, and it went back and forth, and it's like, maybe if you can't explain what it does in a couple of words, then you can't design it that way.
Right, right.
All right, thanks.